The political witness of Scripture it's basically in Scripture, no question about that. But when Scripture is lifted up in its wholeness, in its fullness, and when the way of Jesus and his teachings in life are the guide into that, I mean, I think there's a reason we stand up for the gospel in the Eucharist. It's a way of saying that this gospel informs how we hear all of Scripture. I think Scripture will actually speak as a matter of political witness in the world when it's lifted up aright. And I don't mean bastardizing or perverting Scripture for our own political purposes. That's not what I mean. Let me give you an example. I cannot remember the name of the preacher, but a number of years ago, and I'm going back to the 70s. I was a brand new priest. I was at a gathering. It was a conference, and I don't even remember what the conference was, but I remember this one pastor who had been involved in the anti-apartheid movement. He was an American. And at that point, it was divestment was the issue. This would have been late 70s, early 80s. And he was a Baptist minister. He had been invited to preach in South Africa. And he accepted the invitation. I can't remember. It was churches that were clearly affiliated with anti-apartheid work. But he was allowed to go in under one precondition, that he not preach politics, that he only preached the Bible. And he stood up. I'll never forget. He stood up and he said, "I only preached the Bible. I preached about the Israelites being enslaved in Egypt, and God saying, I have heard the cry of my people who are in Egypt. I have seen their suffering because of their taskmasters, and I have come down to deliver them." He said, "I only preached the Bible." He walked through the Old Testament. He got to the New Testament. "I only preach what Jesus said. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." He said, "I only preach Scripture." Well, Paul said, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand fast then, and do not accept the yoke of slavery again." I only preach the Bible. Anyway, my point is, Scripture, when listened to aright, hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. There is a clarion call to be people of compassion, people of justice, people of righteousness, people of love. There is no question. That is incontrovertible. And you can't tell a preacher, don't preach. Don't preach the values that we hold. Scripture really is, no matter how you cut it, whether you're talking about Moses, which is really obvious, but the Mosaic experience is at the center of the Hebrew Bible. There's no question about that. Palm Sunday, that Jesus entered Jerusalem roughly around the time that Pilate was entering Jerusalem from the other side of town. And Pilate was entering because it was around the time of the Passover, and the Romans, the empire, knew that Passover was about freedom, and that freedom that they were talking about encompassed all of life, and therefore it wasn't playing politics. It was intrinsically political because it was about human life and God's decree that all people should be free. Right. So when you get that way, deal with Scripture that way, you don't have to make partisan political. Let people's. There used to be a commercial. Remember? Listen, I'm going way back in time. Let your fingers do the walking through the yellow pages. Yeah. Do you remember that? Let the congregation's fingers do the walking through the yellow pages, so to speak. And again, so that's one piece. The other piece is there are times and context where you have to speak, and I know that, but they're far and few between. I've been in this business, I think the pension fund said 47 years or something like that. I can only think of a few times when I spoke directly about a political situation or context in those 47 years. And they were very far and few between. There were constant times when I lifted up the values of the gospel, the values of Scripture, and then invited folk to apply them themselves. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
because sometimes if you do it too much, you always applying it,
Yeah.
always making commentary. Well, then is that a sermon or is that just a public commentary?
Right. Right.
And it's a little bit unfair because you got the pulpit and they don't.
Yeah.
And so what I often did, especially in my last parish, was we held adult forums
Mm.
around topical issues, and had guidelines on loving listening and that kind of stuff, so that folk we're not here to debate, we're here to hear what the others are saying, but above all we're trying to hear what the word is saying, what God might be saying through that. and and we did that, so you didn't have folk getting into debates and arguments, but you were engaging scripture and having prescribed questions, and that was a way of actually engaging issues, and bringing scripture to bear and listening to scripture as well as listening to the word through scripture and the word through each other, and doing that kind of loving, respectful listening.